Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining the 22nd webinar in our Pandemics and Society series. Today's webinar topic is What We Know or Don't About H5N1 Transmission on Farms. I'll now pass it to our moderator, Jennifer Nuzzo, the Director for the Brown Pandemic Center at the Brown University School of Public Health at the Brown University, to begin today's conversation. Jennifer?
Hello all and welcome to our discussion. So since January 2022, there have been more than 1,600 outbreaks of highly pathogenic avian influenza H5N1 reported on farms and in backyard flocks that have occurred in every state in the United States. It's estimated more than 166 million birds have been affected. We also know other animals have been affected. And while the virus has not yet developed the ability to spread easily among people, 72 human cases of H5N1 have been reported in North America, of which 70 have occurred here in the US. The CDC classifies the current risk to the general public as low, but the virus does pose a danger to those who may be exposed to infected animals. And of particular concern are farm workers, for whom the virus represents a persistent occupational hazard. Experts have been sounding the alarms about the dangers that this virus may pose to workers on farms, and also for some future scenario where the virus could evolve to spread between people, which would certainly cause another pandemic. And to prevent both of these bad outcomes, it is critical that we mitigate the spread of the virus to and within farms, and also to support farmers and farm workers in these efforts. Now, there have been several proposals floated for efforts to curb the spread of the virus on farms. Some of these proposals include vaccinating livestock against the virus. However, in order to understand the contributions of these proposals, it's crucial that we understand how this virus is spreading. How is it getting on farms? How is it spreading within the farms? And how is it spreading between farms? So that's what we're going to talk about today. And to help us dive deeper into this conversation, to talk about what it means, this challenge means for American farmers. We have the great fortune of being joined today by two panelists who have both written about and spoken about and worked directly on this H5N1 situation on farms here in the US. So first, I'd like to welcome to our discussion Kay Russo, who is a veterinarian and partner at RSM Consulting. Dr. Russo specializes in both dairy and poultry medicine with expertise spanning clinical practice, research, and industry. And then also joining our panel, we'd like to welcome Dr. Gail Hansen, who is senior consultant at the Hansen Consult, and she's also a former Kansas State public health veterinarian. Dr. Hansen advises government and non-government organizations on One Health policy, infectious diseases, animal welfare, and food safety. So thank you both for joining us today. I'm really excited for this conversation. So we will take questions, but first I just wanted to get the conversation going. In the meantime, if you would like to ask our panelists questions, please do feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll be monitoring those questions for when we get to that section. So in the meantime, let's start. Maybe just to start the conversation, I'd love to hear from you both in terms of what you're seeing on farms. I mean, first of all, what has this impact been like on dairy farms and on poultry farms? How have these impacts been the same or different? And what kind of responses have you seen farms take in response to this virus? Maybe we could start with you, Kay.
Awesome. Well, first, thanks for having me here today. I feel like I talk about this more than I care to admit. I like to refer to it as the most expensive volunteer position I've ever held. But I was a part of the initial team that helped to diagnose the first case in dairy cows. I was a dairy vet for several years. I'm also a board certified poultry vet. So uniquely positioned, I guess, to have this discussion. And, this is a virus that we have dealt with, at least from the H5 standpoint, repeatedly over the last decade. We had an outbreak in 2015 that was devastating with H5, and then it sort of resurfaced in 2022. And we really haven't gotten out of that particular epizootic. So on the poultry side, it is classified as a foreign animal disease. And so with that, we go in with a diagnosis and we depopulate or kill all the birds on that premise in order to stamp that virus out to reduce the incidence of lateral spread. And so, over the course, as Dr. Jennifer referred to, the losses since 2022, we've lost in excess of close to 170 million commercial birds. And so we've done a better job since the 2015 outbreak in the birds in that, the stamping out has gotten more efficient. So we saw less lateral spread until the dairy cases came on the scene. And it's considered an emerging disease in the dairy sector, so we do not stamp it out. So we saw a lot of lateral spread off these dairies, which, as you alluded to, we still don't understand, how that virus is moving, but it's certainly treated differently in the dairy sector because it's not, the 75 to 100% mortality we see on poultry. So same virus, two very different diseases, which adds to the complexity of this situation. From the dairy standpoint, we are over 1,000 herds affected in the United States at this point. It blew its way through California. It's starting to slow down there as the number of susceptible herds dwindles. But we're really in what I'd like to refer to as a hot mess right now and trying to disentangle these webs. So that's kind of high level of where we're at, and we can get into the nuances and how we're trying to manage it differently. But just wanted to start with the lay of the land there. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Hansen.
Yeah, and I think the only things that I'd add is that I think at the beginning of this current episode, which started like 3 years ago, I think especially the commercial poultry folks, because they were so sensitized from the earlier pandemic or epidemic, they were more understanding of what was going on. I think the backyard farmers, backyard breeders, backyard or pet owners of chickens and turkeys and other poultry, probably a little less so and perhaps believing it wasn't really going to hit them. And then it's been about a year ago now that it was first discovered in dairy cattle. And I think there was a lot of sort of almost denial of this can't be happening, and this can't be happening. And certainly as a veterinarian, we never heard of influenza in dairy cattle. It's like, doesn't happen, but it did, and it does. And now we've seen it in lots of other, besides our domestic animals, seeing it in a lot of wild animals. We're seeing it in cats. The public is beginning to become, I think, more aware of it recently, and especially, people have talked about the prices of eggs and how that relates to the bird flu that we're seeing.
Thank you both for that. And just maybe to kind of reflect on sort of what's new. So for folks that are tuning in, maybe they haven't joined previous webinars where we've talked about this topic, but just say, as a human epidemiologist, human infectious disease epidemiologist, H5N1 has been on our worry list for a very long time, several decades. It has been a worry because it has caused outbreaks largely in animals, but then humans who are exposed to those animals have gotten sick. We have seen historically very high case fatality ratios. And when they've done serology studies in outbreaks, they haven't found large evidence that a whole bunch of humans have gotten mild infections, and therefore we're just missing that, we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. We have a lot of reasons to think, particularly with historical data, that this is a very deadly virus for the humans who do get infected. But in the last couple of years, something's really changed. I mean, we've seen a rapid expansion of this virus geographically, and we've seen a rapid expansion in terms of animal species. And so for me, as a human epidemiologist, hearing about, first of all, the first infections in cows, which are mammals, we are also mammals, that was worrisome. But then hearing subsequently of farm workers getting infected, understandably, after having, very close contact with these animals, that was clearly worrying. But from the agricultural standpoint, we know poultry farms have been dealing with avian influenza for quite a time, but we seem to be in a different position. So maybe you both kind of reflect on sort of what feels new in particular now to kind of put into context for people who may think that this has been a long-going problem and we're just paying attention to it, but it's not really different or noteworthy compared to what's been happening over the last 20 years.
Sure. So I'll start. I mean, when we first diagnosed that first case in cows, I spent a lot of time on Google, right, reading, and I'm going, oh my gosh, case fatality rate worldwide with H5 is 50%. What is about to happen? Because we had workers complaining of flu-like symptoms, albeit they were mild. So we're all kind of clenched up, like what gives. So far, obviously, if we look at mitigating the major risk, it's going to be for these occupational infections. At present, I wouldn't say the major risk is to the public at large, but if we were to get in front of this, it's really helping to prevent those occupational infections that could lead to mutational events that may result in a more serious outcome. But we can have that conversation, and some folks, like we discussed previously, will kind of turn off because we're in sort of this post-pandemic era, and people are kind of uncomfortable with that. And so, I think the other component of this, even if we don't end up with a human pandemic, is the implications on food security in the country. With the losses incurred in laying hens, with the risk to some of these other production animal species, this could have major implications, and already has, for food availability, eggs being a great example, as well as food cost. And so, aside from the human health risk, the ability to have affordable and safe food in this country is another consideration that I think the public in general should be more interested and aware of. So that's my 2 cents on that, aside from the human piece. So Gail, I'll let you take the reins.
Yeah, and obviously every time the virus gets into an animal, and especially a new animal, it means that it's mutated so that it can do that, and that's what viruses do. And the more times it can come into contact with a new host, the more likely there will be that there's a mutation that sort of sticks. And that's what the concern is, both from the agricultural side and then from the human side. And I sort of have a foot in both camps on that. And the conventional wisdom had been that, well, it needs to have a couple more mutations before it's going to infect and affect mammals. And all of a sudden it was in cows. I was like, okay, now it's in mammals. Now what else does it need? And, there's still a lot we don't know. And, there's a lot we know about influenza viruses, in this one in particular. There's a whole lot we don't know, and sort of know why it affected milk in cattle more than another part of the body. But, why is this version, in most of the workers, it's been a pretty mild conjunctivitis, eye kind of problem. But there's been a new strain of the virus, if you will, that we've seen in the people who have been very, very sick. And the two deaths that we know of have been a different strain of the virus, which means it's mutated again. So far, it hasn't seemed to go from person to person. That's when it becomes a pandemic. When is that going to happen? How is that going to happen? Why is that going to happen? I don't know. I wish I did.
I want to talk about the human infections, but I first just want to kind of get the animal infections covered. So we know that this virus is deadly to birds. But there have been some recent proposals that, perhaps the problem is that we are being too aggressive in our response to the virus when it occurs on poultry farms, that, maybe we shouldn't kill all the birds once an outbreak. Can maybe one of you just kind of weigh in on that proposal and just talk about what the virus does to poultry? And then we'll talk about cows, and maybe one could take cows and one could take birds.
I can speak to it briefly. What you're talking about is RFK statements that we should let it burn through flocks. And, essentially we call this highly pathogenic avian influenza because it's highly pathogenic. That means you're going to see mortality rates in excess of 75, all the way up to 100% of those birds. If you let it move through, it's going to kill them. So if you think, welfare issues exist now and food prices are expensive now, go ahead and let that run through and see what it does to those two things. So beyond that fact, if we are to let it move through flocks unhindered, that also creates large amounts of virus that spill into the environment. And so what's that going to do? It's going to result in lateral spread to wildlife, to neighboring facilities, and it's a major human health risk, right? Because there's folks that have to go in and manage those cases, and again, just the sheer volume of the virus is one that poses a significant occupational health risk in those folks. And so, you know, while I appreciate the administration's interest in trying to look at novel solutions, you know, that's just not going to work in poultry given the nature of the virus itself. You know, on the dairy side, we've kind of let it blow through. We have unhindered because we really don't know how to stop it. And ultimately, we're seeing some level of herd immunity that's developed, but there's still so many questions as to, you know, whether that virus really goes away from those herds. I mean, some of these herds are positive for months at a time. Some, you know, are still popping up positive a year later. So that virus is perhaps lingering in the background as we, you know, these aren't closed herds. We've replaced 30% of the herd every year with potentially naive animals. So it may smolder in the background. And so there's still so much we don't know about the implications of letting it burn through unhindered on the dairy side that I don't think we have a full grasp of the picture yet. So Gail, I'm sorry, I took both species. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I'd say that, you know, historically, there's never been a good outcome by letting a virus just run its course. I don't know why we would think this one would be different. And, you know, to your point that it's highly pathogenic, which means it makes sick and kills a lot of birds. It's highly pathogenic to birds. In other animals, it's real variable. And that's a lot of the stuff we don't know. So in dairy cattle, it doesn't, it affects the milk, and the cattle are sick for a bit, but it's not killing a lot of them. For people, it hasn't seemed to infect us very much yet, and most of the time it's been mild disease, but that may be changing now. We're seeing it in domestic cats, who are, you know, our pet cats, and it's pretty devastating in those animals. So every, you know, highly pathogenic in birds, highly pathogenic, it seems, in cats. Still waiting for information on what it's going to do for other animals, and that's, you know, the sort of watchful waiting that, I mean, I'm calling it watchful waiting, but we aren't just sort of sitting around waiting for things to happen. People are trying to find out the answers to those questions.
And one other thing to add on that, sorry. So we do have low pathogenic H5s and H7s in poultry. They're more apt to mutate into highly pathogenic H5 and H7. Yeah. And so the jury's also still out. You know, yes, we see lower mortality rate in cattle with this virus, but the only thing guaranteed with flu is change. And so it has the propensity, whether it's in a cow or in a person, to potentially mutate to become more virulent. And so, you know, what's true today may be different tomorrow in those species. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that had me especially worried this past winter is that not only can the virus mutate, but it can combine with other influenza viruses. Then you get a chimeric, you get a sort of a brand new virus that no animal has been exposed to, and we don't know what that would do. So the more times people with human flu or pigs with swine flu are in contact with this H5N1 that's what we think of mostly in birds, the more chances we had of, and still have, of getting not only mutations, but a combination that comes up with something that may be even worse. Not to be Dr. Doom, but, you know, there we are.
Can I ask you, for the dairy farmers, the virus is not killing most of the animals, though we did hear of deaths, cattle deaths. There is a report of lost milk production. And so I guess just looking at, I mean, if that were a short-term situation, it would be one thing, but I think nobody believes that this virus is just going to magically disappear. So this is a long-term situation. And so what does that mean for dairy farms, given that, you know, newly susceptible animals are going to be brought into farms, so first-time infections can occur. We think that there are probably reinfections that are occurring. Nobody thinks the virus is going to go away. So what is this, like, the impacts on cattle, you know, dairy cattle look like over the long term, and thinking in terms of like U.S. agricultural interests?
So I can take that. There has been a recent longitudinal study that was published just within, I think it's in preprint still, out of Cornell in tandem with a few folks in Ohio. They looked at Ohio dairy and performed a longitudinal study. And what they found were that the clinical cases of flu cost each producer about, I think it was $930 per clinical case. And when you see, 20 to 30% rate of clinical cases, that adds up to be quite a bit of money. Now, looking at those that were clinical, they were, I believe, 6 times more likely to die during the course of the longitudinal study, and in excess of 3 times more likely to be removed from the herd due to loss of production, essentially associated with that disease. So it does have very real implications on welfare, as well as economic implications for the producers. Now, the long-term impacts of it are what we're still sort of scratching our head over. There's some evidence on histology that there's fibrosis of the udder tissue. Is there going to be a long-term impact on subsequent lactations of those animals due to that damage? And then finally, now that we've seen the D1 genotype jump into dairy herds in Arizona and Nevada, there's a question of whether this virus will mutate around any sort of protection that those convalescent herds have and hit these farms year over year. And even the USDA was saying, oh, it's going to burn itself out and go away. But now we're all kind of taking a step back and thinking, well, maybe that was wishful thinking, and this could be something that will hit repeatedly. And then what? And I have ideas of then what looks like, but that's the $1 billion question there.
Right, and it goes to, do we, sort of, I don't know if it's worst case scenario, but do we have to consider how we're raising dairy cattle, how we're raising poultry? Do we need to be doing something different from what we've been doing in the last, since the 80s or 90s? That's, because one of the ways you spread disease is being, in close contact and being immunologically stressed, and, contamination and cleanliness, and, you sort of see all of those things happening, crowded conditions. You see all of those happening in our, modern agriculture, and does that mean we have to change? And if it does, what does that look like? And I don't have the answers. I just have the questions.
These farms were built for efficiency. They were built for production. They weren't built for disease control or biosecurity in mind. And so with that, that's exactly what Dr. Hansen's saying here. And, how do we, as we build farms in the future, spread out our risk? I think the days of building 4 million bird, complexes probably should be over, because when you get hit, that's a huge loss, right? Because you have to depopulate every bird on site.
Yeah, and I don't think the conversation has really fully acknowledged, the public conversation about this virus and what it's doing to farms. They've acknowledged this as being a long-term scenario that we have to deal with, not just like in a few months it'll kind of whip through and be done. Clearly, we're now at least 2 years in, and it's not going away. I want to turn though to the human infections, and we have found human infections in the United States. The United States is reporting the most number of human infections of any country as of late. We're not the only one that are seeing human infections from this. But what are you seeing or hearing about in terms of farm worker infections? First of all, that's 70 reported cases. Most of those have occurred on farms, not all of them. Some have occurred in people, including people for whom we don't actually know how they contracted the virus, but most of them have occurred in farm workers. First of all, do you think that represents the totality of people who have been infected with this virus on farms? And if not, I'm seeing some shaking hands, so I think we say no. Tell us what you think is the more likely, maybe not exact number, but how big of a problem is this, and why aren't we enumerating fully the infections? I don't know who wants to start, maybe Gail.
Well, and as we seem to be cutting back on our federal workers, and which means the surveillance or tracking disease in animals and in people. it gets harder to figure out what's going on. And if you don't, it's like, if you don't
Can I
look,
just ask you a quick question there?
sure.
Do you have any evidence, or do you think that we have scaled back on surveillance in the last few months because of the administration changes? Has
Yes.
anybody?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know of folks at FDA who are working on HPAI who are no longer there. Surveillance is getting cut back on CDC on the human side. And I don't know that we've ever done a real great job of trying to figure out how to reach people who are most at risk. We've certainly gone into some of the farms, but there's a lot of undocumented workers who work on both poultry and dairy farms who do not have a high regard or trust of government, whether it's federal or state or local government. So they're not likely to go in or have the time or resources to go in to be tested. So there's that issue. There was a study that looked at veterinarians and looking at whether they had been exposed to avian influenza, and a higher percentage than I would have liked to have seen. So I think we've really not expanded our surveillance networks very far on that.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the political environment. If I'm a guy milking cows and I've got that conjunctivitis that's probably due to H5, I'm probably not going to come out and say, hey, test me and maybe you can deport me while you're at it. It's just it's just a bad political environment to get those folks to step forward. And in the beginning of this outbreak in cattle, I worked with CDC and tried to find inroads into some of those communities, whether it was through their churches, through the Spanish radio. Salud in Colorado is one of the outreach mobile health facilities that goes farm to farm. So working through those entities that are less governmental and less scary to these folks, I think has been integral to identifying the infections that we have identified, and will be integral moving forward, because it's less threatening to those folks. And that's going to be your ground zero if we have a pandemic or a large shift in a reassortment event. It's going to be in those folks. So it's going to be imperative that we find ways to work with them in a non-threatening way in order to figure out both the numerator and denominator that you're seeking.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I know that what you've talked about, and I know that when I've worked on outbreaks in communities that have had no trust in government, of going to places like putting clinics in or putting into Walmarts. Where do people go? People go to the grocery store. Everybody has to eat. People go to the grocery store. Walmart is the biggest grocery store. So that
and is that not happening? Like, are we not, like, what is the,
no.
I know from following some of the outbreaks that when there's a known outbreak on a farm, and a public health investigation is launched, certainly there's an effort to offer testing to symptomatic people, not necessarily people who don't report symptoms. And we have some evidence that that misses some people for one way or another. Either they have an infection and they didn't develop symptoms, or they had symptoms, they just didn't report it. But and many have pushed to make sure that testing is available to farm workers outside of their place of employment. Do you have a sense of the extent to which there's knowledge of that, or availability of such testing or outreach, et cetera?
A lot of times it just comes down to the resources, both human resources and money, and availability of tests, availability of the labs to do the tests, developing that trust, so that people feel comfortable to even go, because it's one thing to be offered the test, it's another thing to decide that, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And especially if you haven't had symptoms, and is it possible that asymptomatic people would be more likely to spread it to somebody else? We don't know. But I think, we don't have a public health infrastructure anymore. Public health infrastructure has been tightening its belt so often that they're going to be cut in half in a second. So I think that, instead, we're not increasing the amount of resources. We're not increasing the trust levels to have any of this happen. Once again, sounding like the most pessimistic person on the planet.
Well, and I think the states in which you see the most cases are the states that have done the best job in coordinating that effort. And as I understand it, I don't understand all the intricacies of how these agencies work, but CDC has to be invited into a state. They have to be invited into a local health department in order for that orchestration to occur. The public health department will need to spearhead that effort. If they don't want to do that or don't have the resources to do it, then it's not going to be done. And so again, those states you've seen the most cases in, they've been more effective in that. These cases are occurring in every state that has dairy cases, and in a large proportion of the dairies. Are they significant diseases, in these people, disease in these people? Perhaps not, but it is occurring. So.
And maybe a permutation question, quick question, and then I want to get to the title of this webinar, which is just, we haven't heard of a human case in quite a while. Do you think that's because they're not happening, or we're just not looking for them right now?
If I had to guess, I'd say we're not effectively looking for them.
I would,
but
yeah, to me, it's an educated guess that we're not looking. You don't look, you don't find. I mean, you can get rid of, you aren't going to get rid of the disease by not looking for it, but you can sort of hide your head in the sand until it becomes too big to be able to handle.
Okay, so the title of this webinar is What Do We Know or Don't About Spreading on Farms? So what do we know about how the virus is getting onto farms? Because if we realize that farms are the particularly risky places, both in terms of occupational infections, as well as places where mutations could occur that could kick off a pandemic, what do we know about how the virus is getting onto farms? How it's spreading between farms, if that's how it's spreading between farms, et cetera. This is important because if we want to kind of control the virus, we need to understand these drivers of transmission. Like, how is it getting onto farms? Is it wild birds who are putting it onto farms? Is it the movement of people? Because depending on what the answer is, the solution set for preventing infections on farms will be different. And I'm a little bit worried that I've not heard a very clear explanation for the drivers of transmission, introduction of the virus onto farms and transmission, et cetera.
I think part of that is because there's a lot of it we don't know. We do know that wild birds can transmit the disease very
to the
very
animals,
easily,
to like
to other animals, to cattle, to other birds. They've now found the virus in rats and mice. How efficient they are, we don't know. It's in the milk. Is it being transmitted via milking machines? There's some indication that that's happening, but raw milk and raw diets being fed to cats. We know that we know what some of them are, but there's still a lot of the pieces we don't yet know.
And it sounds like we also don't know the relative contribution of each of those. Because to me, if it's being spread on between like contaminated milking equipment or workers with soiled clothing going between farms, there's a fairly easy fix there, I would think. Versus if it's like wild birds or rodents, that seems like a much harder thing to prevent the introduction of the virus. But Kay, what do you think?
I'm going to go ahead and share that epi results out of Colorado to just really illustrate a couple points here.
Yeah.
So let me know when you can see it.
Yep.
So
yeah.
Okay, great. So this came out of Colorado's epi investigations, and the lines, as I understand it, are the movement or relationships between the different facilities that were involved in the outbreak that answered the questionnaires. And so what becomes abundantly clear really quickly is it's a very interconnected network between dairies and between poultry facilities. Now, I believe these circles represent a common, essentially, ancestor of the virus, so a very similar fingerprint. So that shows you sort of how the virus moved from facility to facility in terms of most probabilistic way based on the genetic sequence. But it's just really an extraordinary web of connections. And so when we try to sit down and tease this out, it can feel really overwhelming. We know they have a lot of connections, but we don't know which one of these connections are the highest risk. And so this is just people movement. This is, people movement alone within a geography.
Okay, so this isn't the virus moving. The circles represent the virus in terms of its common genetic.
Yeah, so this dairy infected this dairy most likely based on the genetic sequence, but look at just all of these connections between these farms, right? And so when you go to try to like figure that out, it can be really overwhelming. And so, you know, other things that concern me in terms of you know, the transmissibility piece. Since in the beginning of this, it was like, oh, this is a lactating only cow disease. It's lactating only because we found the virus in really high levels in the milk, right? It like extraordinary levels in the milk. But, you know, I went through on the back end early on and with some other vets, and we collected blood from non-lactating animals on affected farms. So these are animals that are either not old enough to have a calf and lactate, or animals that are in their dry period. So that's kind of their downtime before they give birth again. And we found seroconversion in a small fraction of them, anywhere between 12 or 10 to 15% of these animals had seroconverted. And so, you know, what does that tell me? That tells me there's a transmission pathway outside of the milking parlor, which has been the narrative here all along. And so, you know, I see some questions in the chat here. Is aerosol a component here? Well, there's been some work out of the University of Saskatchewan, that a challenge study, and they went through and they tested air in the parlor, they tested air in the animal housing facility post-challenge and found viral RNA there. They didn't do virus isolation to show whether it was viable or not, but there's likely additional transmission pathways outside of cow to cow on milking machine. And so you throw all of this together and it's like, oh my gosh, like, how is this moving? But really it's going to involve, you know, I've said this a few times, is in the face of an acute outbreak, it's going to involve an epidemiological team to come in and just start sampling, you know, and seeing how where they're finding the virus, where they're not finding the virus. And Dr. Jason Lombard's done a lot of this work. You know, he's looked at a lot of this, and he's still, I think, scratching his head. But the more we do that, the better we kind of disentangle this web to figure it out.
Right. And as an epidemiologist, sort of, as you pointed out, where you're seeing the virus, where you're not seeing the virus, where you expect to see it, you don't, where you don't expect to see it, that you do, those sort of outliers are really important. You know, sort of back to the question of air, you know, in the air. You know, the virus obviously does get into the air, and there was a study or there was a paper, I don't know if it was published yet, out of Spain, where they had, it looks like there was a transmission on from poultry farm to poultry farm that doesn't appear that there's any human interaction, though that's always a hard thing to tell. But it looks like it was airborne, perfect good conditions, not too far away. So yeah, there's, I think, trying to your point of trying to figure out the attribution, so that even if we don't know all the ways to do it, if we know sort of the predominant way, you can sort of try to get to some of the biggest.
And if
I mean, I see that graph that you showed, Kay, and I'm just like, I don't even know what to make of that. There's a whole bunch of associations that may be just spurious, right?
That's right. And you know, I'm going to show one more and then I'll stop sharing my stuff because I know nobody wants to look at PowerPoint all day. But this is a result of the, let's see, the EPI investigation in Michigan that I plucked this from. And they went through and they did, you know, basically EPI work and looked at, you know, risk factors between operations. And so, you know, to get the virus into the cows in a given geography, it was often moved in through animal movement. And then thereafter, there was, you know, farm to farm spread. But again, so many shared visitors, vehicles, and equipment that, I'll be honest, they're not cleaned in between on the dairy side. And then shared workers. There were workers that would pick up shifts at another dairy. There were workers that shared housing with poultry workers. And there were workers that worked on poultry and milk cows on the weekend. And then, you know, as Dr. Gail alluded to, all of these sort of peri-domestic species in a given geography that we're seeing spill over into, you know, what role do they play? You know, so as we look at sort of defining a path forward, I think when we have a situation of outbreak, when we draw that, you know, 10 kilometers around that poultry farm, testing the wildlife, but also testing all at-risk species in that 10-kilometer zone, whether it's a cow, a horse, a pig. I think that will help us to better characterize this virus ecology, so we can really figure out if we're missing a sink for this virus that may be, sort of perpetuating it moving forward. So that's all
I mean,
got.
at the risk of sounding like an academic here, I will just say, like, understanding the practices of infected farms is an interesting hypothesis generating scenario, but to understand which, if any, of those practices are what's causing transmission, we need to compare them to the farms that aren't experiencing outbreaks to see how they're different.
Right.
This may sound like a really academic point, but correct me if I'm wrong. There's been like $1 billion allocated for improved biosecurity, right? And if this is a long-term, maybe that number is wrong, but significant portions of federal funding allocated to improve biosecurity on farms, which, I think people think is inherently a good thing. But if our goal is truly to try to interrupt transmission on farms, we really have to have a better understanding of how the virus is getting onto farms and how it is moving between farms, because I worry that we could be investing in measures or practices that actually aren't going after what the drivers are.
Well, if it's being pulled in on the ventilation, I'm sorry, but there's very little you can do to stop that in a facility that's moving, 200,000 CFMs of air per 100,000 birds. I mean, you can't put a filter on that and move enough air. And so, what does that leave us with then? And, I'm in the school of vaccination, so I'm going to say that. I think that's an important measure here. When we look at biosecurity and find, we can only get 80% there, just throwing a number out. We need something additional, and that is improving the immunity of the host, which our poultry are always naive. So they're always, quote unquote, sitting ducks for this virus. So, I think we'll go through an exercise and we'll perhaps identify some of the major risk factors, but also realize there's some of this that we just can't avoid. And so then what? We're going to end up with the same conclusion. And that's vaccinating poultry, in my mind.
Yeah, I agree that we need to vaccinate poultry as well, at least some of our poultry, whether there's 1 or 2 vaccines and how that's delivered. I'd love to get one that's given in ovo, as we do for some of the other.
We have them. We have
and
them
my
available.
understanding
Or HPA. And the other thing that I think that people don't realize is how much movement there is intrastate and interstate of dairy cattle. I think that's being being watched a little bit more closely now, but there's a lot of movement of animals across state lines, and we're bringing the virus in without trying too hard.
Okay, I'm going to try to turn to some of the questions in the chat. We have a bunch, so maybe we could just have some short answers to them. One question is about H5N1. We know is present in cow milk. Have they investigated other lactating mammals? And any info on how may it affect lactating humans? Any quick
I think that there was a goat outbreak before we discovered the virus in cows in Minnesota as a progenitor virus to V313. I think that they did identify the virus in the milk from those does. And also they had some outbreaks in alpaca in Idaho. I'm not entirely certain if they checked the milk on those animals, but I do believe it affected the crias in a utero. So I think they're across mammalian species that, yes, influenza A can concentrate in the milk. I don't know if there's someone that's more adept that can answer this than I am, though.
I don't know if I'm more adept, but just to add one more, that there was a sheep that was found where they did find it in the milk as well. So, yeah, mammals and milk, I think is another place where some just basic research needs to happen.
Just scrolling through, there's several questions about milk testing and the suspension of milk testing by FDA. Are you hearing things about that? Are you concerned about that?
So are you referring to the jobs that have been lost that are responsible for ensuring the safety of?
Someone mentions FDA suspending its milk quality testing program and potential implications for our drinking milk supply.
Yeah, I just saw that in the news as well, that they're suspending at least the quality assurance and proficiency testing for milk, and and what that's going to do, if that continues long term for not only bird flu, but a host of other things, is worrisome, at
It's
least.
like a good idea right now.
But just to be clear, we're not particularly worried about pasteurized milk transmitting the virus to.
No, I was most skeptical in the beginning, just given the load, and I can say confidently that I'm not worried about pasteurized milk. I will give my kids pasteurized milk.
Yeah.
I couldn't always say this in the beginning of this. I wasn't sure.
Exactly.
But I can confidently say that today. The piece that is somewhat worrisome is obviously the raw milk aged cheeses. They have found residual virus after the 60-day aging process. And so that would be a food safety concern. And then the other piece of this, are the cats that have been affected by raw diets. We're seeing a number of these outbreaks due to poultry meat that is adulterated, in addition to, in California, for instance, we saw a cat succumbing to the virus after being given raw milk from affected dairies.
There are a couple questions in the Q&A about cats, and there was recently some articles about cats. Can we talk about cats? And I'm sure people who are pet owners are particularly worried about getting the virus from their cats. What are your thoughts?
And owners are also worried about the fact that so far it's been pretty fatal in cats, at least a 50% fatality rate. So nobody wants to, you certainly don't want to get bird flu from your cat, but you also don't want to lose your cat. And Dr. K, you've done more than I have on this, so.
Yeah, so it's my understanding that cats have the high concentration of those sialic acid receptors for the virus in their brain. And so, some of the veterinarians that submitted cats early on for this, they found CT levels of 9 in those cats' brains that were affected by the virus. So you'll see some respiratory signs, which, often progress to neurologic symptoms in these animals with a high mortality rate. So the farms that had populations of feral cats lost large numbers of those animals during their outbreaks. The concern, obviously, is cats also can move long distances. They can potentially be an intermediary host for this virus. And from a house cat perspective, particularly indoor-outdoor animals, we have a lot of this virus in wild birds right now. And so if they're hunting birds, and they have a potential of being exposed. I would confidently say, do not feed your animals raw diets right now, particularly cats, given what we know and the risk factors. We should cook our food. But certainly it's one of those things. They've been a bit of a canary in the mine, and really kind of devastating for these little creatures. So, again, the role they're playing in the movement of the virus is yet unclear, but we know it's highly fatal for them.
So we don't know a lot, I've gathered from you, in terms of how the virus is showing up on farms and how it's spreading between farms. But there have been some questions in here about vaccines. Some people have raised a question about FAR UVC. What would your proposal be to farms who are looking to, or not just to farms, like what would the proposal be to help farms deal with this virus, protect themselves from this virus? You mentioned vaccine. And okay, I've heard you before talk about your very clear proposals for thinking about vaccines on farms, but I'd like to hear from both of you and what we think should be happening on farms, recognizing some of this is out of the control of farms, and there may be like a federal levers that needs to be pulled. But if you were going to design the program to protect farms, what would it be?
Yeah, certainly vaccination comes to mind for poultry. I'm not sure that I wish I knew more about what it would do or wouldn't do on dairy cattle or other other domestic animals. I think we do need to, as was mentioned before, sort of look at how are we raising animals and be thinking about disease prevention as well as productivity. So does that mean less dense, smaller farms, looking at, what animals can take the stresses of production better, what kind of genetics can be and herd husbandry can we be doing to increase the or decrease the stress of the animals? Making sure that making sure that protective personal protective equipment PPE is available and is able to be used, and does that mean that at some point it's going to have to be mandated by a farm or the large companies? Possibly. Those are sort of the things that come to mind.
From my perspective, I'm at heart a production vet, and so I'd like to keep it simple as possible. So for poultry, or dairy, there's really three approaches. You keep it out through biosecurity, you keep it in through quarantine when you're affected, and you manage the susceptible populations. And what I mean by that is improve their resistance to the agent. And so poultry does a great job with biosecurity and quarantine. They're kind of to the point where they're doing as good a job as they can. There is procedural drift. We have to stay on top of that as producers, as vets, to make sure people are trained and understand the why behind what they're doing. And so I think the focus in poultry is going to be improving the immunity of the host. So we have vaccines that are made in the United States that are licensed in the United States. We cannot use them because we're not allowed to. But there's recombinant vaccines that can be applied at the hatchery, either in the egg or in the bird. And then, so we would vaccinate, if we were to vaccinate, probably the layers in the country. We wouldn't focus on broilers, broiler breeders. We may vaccinate some turkeys in high-risk zones. But for layers, for instance, we give a vaccine at the hatchery. We'd follow it up with a kill vaccine before point of lay in what we call the pullets. We're handling them during those 2 times anyways. It's not going to add an extra handling event. Those vaccines are available in the United States. We just can't use them. We export them to other countries. So in poultry, I think vaccine's the way to go. In dairy, I think we need to do a hell of a lot better of a job at biosecurity. We need to figure out when we get hit with a foreign agent, essentially how can we maintain continuity of business without spreading the virus. And so we need to have a plan in place moving forward, because we did a really poor job here. We facilitated moving this virus around the country in our cattle. We do have some natural immunity that's being afforded post-exposure. Whether that's going to protect in the long term, I'm not certain. So again, as we turn over 30% of these herds every year, what do we do with those susceptible animals we're adding? I think vaccines have a place there as well. And then in terms of, getting in front of the issue, better epi, right? Figuring out how that virus is moving with, keeping in the back of our mind, we might not be able to control those movements depending on what's moving it. And finally, a more nationalized plan where all at-risk species have some degree of monitoring. We can't, monitor the heck out of poultry and then, not monitor these other production animal species. They could be sinks for this virus that we're unaware of. So I know that was a lot, but I try to keep it simple and straightforward. And I think that will help us get in front of this beast. And obviously the human piece, Dr. Hansen touched on.
And maybe I'll just add to my wish list, which is just the general surveillance for this virus, both testing humans and just, detecting outbreaks. I think we have a lot of reason to be concerned about it. I think this is a time for us to really enhance our wastewater surveillance, so we at least have a better sense of places that we should just be looking to, probably forward deploying or re-encouraging the whys, as you said, just to remind people that, we think there's more threat to your farm now, and some of these enhanced measures are particularly warranted. I'm worried that our wastewater surveillance may disappear as of this summer due to a funding lapse. So to me, this is like a pretty cheap, not as punitive testing approach as some of the other ones that have been floated. We only have 5 minutes, and I will end on time. So one of the questions, just to get your sense, looking through here, there's a few questions about sort of the genotypes. And for a while there, we were hearing, well, the farm worker infections have been mild, and a lot of people were trying to explain that, well, the farm workers got the cow virus and not the bird virus. We know that a teenager in British Columbia was hospitalized for quite a long time, very ill with I'm sorry, shorthanding here, the bird virus. And some people were trying to sort of explain away the risk that this virus poses to humans by trying to assign blame it on the genotype. What do you think of that? Are you, and now it feels almost moot because we're seeing both forms show up places. So, I think this idea that we could just, get the good one and avoid the bad one seems to me a little bit unrealistic. But just your quick thoughts on the role that the genotype may be playing in terms of some of the severity of symptoms or differences in the outbreaks.
Well, I think in people, the genotype really does seem to make a difference, because the people who the two people who have died, one in Mexico and one in the US, and then the person in British Columbia, had a different genotype than we had been seeing in most of the dairy and poultry workers. Can we sort of stamp out that one and not get another genotype that's going to be just as give us just as much disease, and potentially even then be able to go from person to person? I don't know, but I think you're exactly right. Looking at wastewater and doing surveillance to figure out where things are, where things aren't. We've got to do a lot more of that than we've been doing.
So from my perspective, the genotype B313 versus the D1X, I'll call it, because there's D1.1, D1.2, D1.3. Initially, we kind of could use it to our advantage to determine, where the infection was coming from, for instance, on poultry or in people. If it was B313, it definitely was, more likely coming from cattle. If it was D1, it definitely wasn't coming from cattle. And maybe not B313, definitely cattle, because it did spill into poultry to the tune of 70% of the poultry or the layers last year. But at this point, I think that the D1 is the predominant strain being moved by migratory waterfowl. It is the one that we have seen cause the devastation in Indiana and Ohio most recently in poultry. And it's going to be hard to stamp out if that's the one that is endemic in our waterfowl. I think, I'm not a virologist or really even a flu expert in a lot of ways, but I think the piece to this that people have to understand is, given the segmented genomes, that a genotype today, if it reassorts with something different tomorrow, can have very different properties. And so we can try to hang our hats on the genotype. It seems the D1 is causing the more severe human infections, but I think our denominator is still unknown there. I think we have to consider both as being major risks for us from an animal agriculture as well as a human health perspective. And again, that could change, tomorrow very quickly.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's really humbling. I think an overarching theme that emerged from our conversations today is a lot of unknowns, and a lot can absolutely change, and already has changed in the relatively short period of time that this has been a national conversation about this virus. I would like to thank you both for, first of all of your work to help farmers, and to educate the public about this. I'm really grateful to you both for sharing your knowledge and your time today. This has been a really excellent conversation. I'd also like to add some thanks to my Pandemic Center colleagues who helped put this event together: Bentley Holt, Michael Mitchell, Leah Lovegren, Amanda Kogan, Carly Gaska, Andrea Ulig, Ann Wang, and Alice Im. For those who are watching, there was a question in the chat. Yes, we are going to make a recording of this available. So that will be available on our website. But if you'd like to stay up to date on future sessions, there will be a QR code on the screen that you can use to access our link tree. And there you can sign up for our webinar mailing list, catch up on the past recordings, and explore other resources like our weekly tracking report, which includes, as it says, weekly updates on topics like H5N1. The recording of today's session will be available on our events page of our website probably next week. And that's where all of our previous webinars will be. Please also follow us on social media for updates, and feel free to reach out with questions or suggestions. We'd love to hear from you. We're going to send out, for those who registered, a link to this recording, as well as some additional resources, some of the things referenced today. And until our next session, thank you all. We're adjourned, and I wish everyone, hope you are all safe, healthy, and everyone stay engaged. Thanks so much.